from Witchcraft Heirlooms, and I'm here today to do my 20th century witchcraft journey through the 1950s today. So we have this cute little pin-up thing happening. I had to do it really quick after I finished work today, so the back of my head is not curled, so let's make sure I don't turn my head too far. Hey there, if you're watching, make sure you throw a hashtag live in the comments. This is my 20th century witchcraft journey through the 1950s live stream. We're going to be talking a little bit about witchcraft in the 1950s, but we're going to talk about pop culture. We're going to talk about of course, things that were happening in the legal world and all over the place in the decade that kind of led to where we are today, especially within the pagan community, but certainly as a country as a whole. Before I do that, real quick, I am just getting myself set up a smidgen more so that I can see all the comments, because on Facebook, this is a little bit, because I have two devices happening at the same time. On Facebook, it is a little extra special and it requires a little extra work to get to do what I want to do. So, I am going to, oh look, there's already a comment here that I missed. Oh, hey Megan. All right, let me do that. Wonderful. Okay, here we are. So, in our pre-show, one of the things that I wanted to talk about is the Witchcraft Acts. And I know that seems like a really weird thing to be talking about in my intro. Again, if you're here watching, especially if you're on Facebook, if you want to throw a hashtag live in the comments, that would be great, just so I can see who you are, so I can say hello, because Facebook doesn't tell me who's here. It just gives me a little number at the top of the screen with the little eyeball, and I want to say hello. So let me say hi by putting a hashtag live into the comments. And same thing on Instagram, because the hashtag live helps the algorithm reach out and find other people who might want to watch. Hey Aubrey, thank you for the tag. Alright, so let's talk about the Witchcraft Acts. The reason why I decided to do those in the pre-show for today is because one of the most kind of important ones, especially in the modern day, actually just in general, was repealed in the 1950s. So it's something that you see a lot when you're reading up on history, especially for the decade as it relates to the pagan community. And I thought that we could do a little bit of deep dive into that. In these first few minutes, while we wait for folks to show up, just because it takes time for the algorithm to tell people, hey, guess what? Avani's live. So this is what we're going to do while we wait for more folks to come. So let's talk about the Witchcraft Acts. So the Witchcraft Acts, try saying that like 10 times fast, started in the 16th century, so that's the 1700s, I think. Me and numbers aren't on great terms, so I could be wrong on that. Oh, the 1500s, look at that. I even made a note for myself so I wouldn't mess it up, and I messed it up anyway. So in the 1500s in Scotland and England, and those Witchcraft Acts, oh, hey Amanda, thanks for the live tag. The Witchcraft Acts made witchcraft a criminal offense punishable by death, often by burning at the stake. So everyone's heard the idea of like burning witches at the stake. This is where it comes from. Hey Plants Breathe, we're here talking about 1950s, journey through the 1950s, 20th century witchcraft today. But we're talking about the Witchcraft Acts while we wait for folks to show up. Henry VIII's Act of 1542, a very specific one, was the first one to define witchcraft as a felony, specifically, meaning that it was a crime that was punishable by death, and also forfeiture of personal property. So if they had anybody who was family, they might not necessarily inherit the land or their personal property because of becoming a witch. Oh, someone said, hey, beautiful, hi. I have my 1950s outfit on for you today. Hey, Michelle, we're doing 20th century witchcraft, journey through the 1950s. We're talking about the Witchcraft Acts real quick while we wait for folks to show up. So getting back to Henry VIII's Act of 1542, it was especially focused on outlawing magic that would help a person in the unnatural acquisition of wealth, or making someone fall in love with another person against their will. Now, we both know in the modern world that doing magic to make someone fall in love with you against your will is kind of a no-no anyway. But of course, back then, sometimes morals were a little bit more slippery than they are now. And, you know, they were also looking for reasons to like get mad at people and punish them. Hey, Pomegranate Darkling, we're here talking about journey through the 1950s, 20th century witchcraft. I'm just doing a little bit of a pre-show here while we wait for lovely folks like you all to show up. I just realized I haven't waved at anybody on Instagram. Oh, and I made a note here because I thought this was interesting, because a lot of the sites that I saw that were talking about the Witchcraft Acts didn't draw this parallel, but I kind of did. So, I mean, I think that we all, well, a lot of people, I don't want to say all, but a lot of people probably have an idea or know that one of the most prolific peoples for offering services like spells and divination, which were often the targets of these Witchcraft Acts, were the Romani. And as a matter of interest, the Romani actually began to migrate into Europe and Britain in the 1500s, which I do not think is a coincidence. Just saying. So in not even close to 19, in 1563, Elizabeth I amended that act to be a little bit more lenient. So instead of, dying, the person would only be subject to death if harm to somebody was done as a result of the magic. Liz says she tried to find me on YouTube. The YouTube is only uploaded after the live, and that's just because it became way too cumbersome to have 3 devices happening at the same time. So what happens is after this, I will upload my Instagram video to YouTube. Plus, it's cuter that way because it has all the filters and stuff. So my Instagram has like a vintage film filter on it, so it makes it extra cute. And period for our 1950s day. So interestingly, in the time of Elizabeth I, when she was reigning, only out of 157 accused people, only 9 of those people were men, which is sort of interesting. In 1604, witchcraft became a felony offense again? Question mark. I imagine this was referring to, I think this was talking about in England, and the other one might be in, maybe someone made it a criminal offense again. I didn't make that very clear to myself in my notes here. But in any case, at that point in time, the reason why they did that was so that people who were accused of witchcraft could be tried under common law, as opposed to the Queen's Law or the King's Law, which was underneath the Church, which is many viewed as a positive thing. Megan says McKenna won't let her watch the full thing. That's okay. You can always watch on the replay. I'm glad that you came. I appreciate the support. I'll always catch you another time, I'm sure. I lost my track again. Oh, so it became common law infraction, so to speak. And at that point, burning at the stake was off the table. That was when it became no longer a thing. It was much more common that witches were hung. Or in the case of some people I know in Salem, they had someone who was pressed to death. That was Giles Corey, which that one sticks in your brain, even if you've never heard anything about him. Just to read pressed to death on a gravestone somewhere is kind of horrifying. And then, of course, in 1735, the Witchcraft Act kind of marked a huge reversal in a lot of the attitudes towards witchcraft. And the main thing that happened with that Witchcraft Act is that it made it so that it was not itself a crime, but instead the charlatanism or the claiming of having spiritual or magical powers became the crime, not the witchcraft itself. And offenders were often subjected to things like fees and imprisonment. People didn't die anymore. People weren't put to death. It wasn't a thing. Again, it may have been. It often made it so that people who were accused were viewed as con artists or vagrants. Hey, Elle, we're here talking about 20th century witchcraft. I'm just talking about the Witchcraft Acts, which were actually repealed in the 1950s, which is what I'm just about to get to, actually. So we're almost into the meat and potatoes of today. With my Stepford Wife outfit. And of course, like I said, the Witchcraft Act of 1735 was repealed in 1951 was something that was called the Fraudulent Mediums Act, which outlawed the claim of spiritual power for anything other than entertainment purposes. So if you've ever been on a website, what is happening here? This is being so weird. Whatever. If you've ever been on a website for any place that sells psychic readings or witchcraft supplies or anything that makes any sorts of claim of like, oh, this will help with your love life, it will always say for entertainment purposes only. Not because they don't believe in their product, but because legally they were required to include that for it to not fall under those laws that are supposed to be preventing those things from happening. So in case you ever wanted to know that thing. So that said, that is our Witchcraft Act intro. Let's talk about what you came here for, and that is 20th century witchcraft, journey through the 1950s. And again, if you're here watching and you haven't already done it, if you could throw a hashtag live into the comments, hashtag replay if you're watching on the replay, it just helps other people find us. So some historical and cultural events that happened in the 1950s that kind of led to where we are today, both as a spiritual community and as a country in general. The 1950s, while it definitely has a decided aesthetic and style, I'm sorry, I'm sticking to my chair here. It's very uncomfortable. It really laid a lot of the groundwork for what actually was to come. Here, I'm just going to fix this. There was a war in the 1950s, so that was the Korean War, although it was very short-lived and didn't have a huge impact on the popular culture beyond World War II, which had ended, which was in 1941 or 1940s rather. It was a big deal. Um, but following the Korean War and World War II, the economy saw a really big stabilization, which means that people were out there spending a lot more money on entertainment. And one of the big things that came out in the 1950s was the boom of television. The very first transcontinental TV broadcast aired in 1950. And at that point, between the excitement of this new technology and the boom of the economy, all of a sudden everybody was buying up television sets to have in their living room. And in 1951, I Love Lucy, which I think everybody has at least heard of, actually premiered, sparking the rise of what many call the golden age of television. Bewitched, because I looked it up, actually didn't happen until the 1960s. So keep your eyes peeled, because in the 1960s we get to talk about Bewitched, and I'm pretty stoked about that. And of course, in the 1950s is when the civil rights movement started in earnest. And while, of course, many of us within the pagan community are not necessarily, I mean, we are all allies, so while it doesn't necessarily apply to all of us in the same way, I think that the civil rights movement in many ways was what sparked the beginning of the social justice movement, sort of where we are today, talking about the idea of equality and justice and not discriminating against people for their differences, no matter what those differences may be, but of course, especially race in this situation, especially in the 1950s. Because in the 1950s, blacks were actually legally prevented from getting the same educational opportunities, although they did begin the process of desegregation in the 1950s, which is great. And in the 1950s is when we had that whole story of Rosa Parks, which I know I learned in school, in which Rosa Parks was seated in a bus and she was asked to get up and move to make space for someone who was white, presumably, and she refused, which was a big deal. So that is a big thing that happened as well. And of course, in 1954, J.R.R. Tolkien published Fellowship of the Ring, which I think we can all agree, the fantasy entertainment industry in general, I think has had a huge impact on the pagan community, at the very least because there's so much crossover in subcultures. And of course, I believe that it inspired a lot of people to learn more about magic, much in the way that I would think that Harry Potter and Bewitched and Sabrina the Teenage Witch and many others, and Charmed, inspired people. So Lord of the Rings was just the first of many that probably had that impact. In 1955, rock and roll hits the mainstream. So big changes in music, big changes in attitudes, big changes in social interactions as a result of this big movement. And interestingly, in 1956, the motto "In God We Trust" was adopted as the national motto, which I also think is interesting. I don't know exactly how it impacts us, but I suspect that it does in some way that doesn't occur to me right this second. I'm just gonna make sure that I'm not missing anything else. I just realized I wasn't at the bottom, so I couldn't see. Hi, Al. Sorry, I missed your original comment. And I've got whatever. I just realized that this filter is doing weird things, but that's okay. So some legal things that were happening in the law in the 1950s that led to where we are today. Of course, like I mentioned in the intro, the Witchcraft Act of 1735 was repealed and replaced by the Fraudulent Mediums Act, which basically outlawed the claim of spiritual power for anything other than entertainment purposes. Ugh. And now Instagram says it isn't responding, so I'm going to wait and hope for the best, because if this video doesn't work, then I am probably not going to be able to upload it, and that would be terrible. So, as I was saying, so that's the disclaimers. So, in the 1950s, as a decade, also saw the emergence of self-proclaimed hereditary witches. So, this is the point in history where we really start hearing from people who actually were witches. A lot of people cite the Witchcraft Act of, 17... Oh, Elle says it's working on her end. Thank goodness. A lot of people cite the repealing of the Witchcraft Act of 1735 as a sort of inciting factor for why lately, which is super frustrating. Oh, I think I'm back. I think I fixed it. I just had to turn on our Wi-Fi. I hope that y'all are still here. Thank you so much for your patience. Oh, hey, Michelle, I see you on Facebook now, too. I know it keeps pausing. But getting back to Gerald Gardner, he created Wicca. The controversy over whether or not it was part of a hereditary, a tradition that he... Yes, I know I'm back. Thank you so much. Whether or not it was a hereditary tradition that he learned through family, over the course of generations, is kind of unclear. I think it's somewhere in the middle. I think that a lot of what he kind of included in Wicca was things that he learned, things that he studied, that he kind of threw together into a big amalgamation of universal themes and truths that came from lots of different cultures and backgrounds. Because looking at a lot of, like we look at if you ever watch any of my Sabbath series where I talk about the holidays, I talk about how they're often an amalgamation of various different cultures and holidays, most often Norse Germanic, Celtic, and Anglo-Saxon. So I think that a lot of what he was writing about was based on those cultures, which he had done a significant amount of studying on his own, not necessarily taught by anyone in his family. But I digress. So at the time, I made a note here because I know that in the modern day we have a lot of argument over witches versus Wiccans, and one is one and one is not the other, and who's what. But in the 1950s, a lot of writers actually use the term Wicca or Wicca with an E, not an A, to refer to the entire, basically, pagan, Wiccan, witch umbrella. So if you ever start reading any of the older texts that are out there, you may find that there's a lot of crossover, and that they may use that word to refer to people who today would shudder at the idea. Some other well-known witches at the time that were claiming hereditary tradition were some of which were somewhat well-known are Sybil Leek, which I know I had heard of, Charles Cardell, Raymond Howard, Roland Nordick, and Robert Cochrane, all of which were at that point in time somewhat well-known within the community. Some other notable figures and publications that happened, many of which by Gerald Gardner, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, from the 1950s. In 1954, Gerald Gardner published a book called Witchcraft Today. The introduction of that book was written by a woman named Margaret Murray. Now, if you were here for my 1920s video, so that's a little ways back now, you can always go back and rewatch, I talk about Margaret Murray because she wrote a really influential paper in the 1920s that talked about the evolution of what she called the witch cults, which is sort of what I'm referring to when I talk about the idea of hereditary witches and people who had a tradition that they've been passed on down generations and generations for perhaps, indefinitely. So that was one of the things that she was studying academically, and Gerald Gardner actually found her work very, very inspiring, which was not really a secret. She was sort of like a big inspiration for him, and she actually wrote the introduction to that book, which I'm sure, I can just imagine that he was probably totally fangirling about it because he just loved everything she did. So that's kind of neat. And of course, his book also was a very much in great part about the evolution of the witch cult as well. And it was very anthropological, historical, academic. It wasn't like witchcraft books we find today that tend to be more like, this is how you do a ritual, this is how you do a spell, this is what an athame is for. This was more like academic, like talking about factual things from other people's studies. It was really sort of an amalgamation of things that he had learned and he had studied on his own, and he kind of put into this singular book so that all the information that related to witchcraft that he wanted to share with other people was in one place. And then again in 1959, he published a book called The Meaning of Witchcraft, Gerald Gardner again, which was a sequel, of course, to the Witchcraft Acts, but it focused a lot more on the minutiae of actually doing rituals, of actually doing spells, and actual ritual formats, which was a big deal for people who were trying to practice in solitary, to be able to kind of pick it up and try to work with it. And as I mentioned here again, the repealing of the Witchcraft Act left a big opening for people to be able to discuss these things openly, and it made a really big deal. People were finally able to be like, yep, I'm a witch, and as long as they weren't selling anybody anything or making the proper disclaimers that it was only for entertainment purposes only, everything was copacetic. Finally, people could be out in the open. So the 1950s saw a huge increase in the amount of information that was being put out there. about witchcraft and about paganism. And of course, Gerald Gardner also, knew many other people in the community. And I also talked about him in the 1940s too. That was when he was studying with the New Forest Coven during World War II. But there's so many cool things happening in those decades. And then, so the final thing I want to talk about before we get to our end of things here, our little live sale, of course, and the tarot card readings for anybody who wants one. Things to do about style and design in the 1950s. So if you're ever out there thrifting, like I am frequently doing myself, and you pick up a thing and you're wondering, like, I wonder when this is from, because most things aren't stamped, which would be cool if they were. These are some kind of things that are characteristic of items and decor and pieces that came in the 1950s. Oftentimes, coming up with different colors of paint became much more easier technology-wise in the 1950s. So this is when color sort of exploded onto the scene. Some really common colors that were used were red, white, and black. So like if you think of like the typical like 1950s diner, that's often the color scheme that's used. Also like that mint green turquoisey color. I don't exactly have that in my dress. Which, by the way, I want to give a quick shout out to Lilac Blossoms, from whom I got this dress just in time for today, like right before this live stream. I had no idea what I was going to wear, and it showed up at my front door today, so thank you for that. So other things that were big for style in the 1950s, really bold patterns. Things like florals, of course, but also fruits. Stripes got really big. Polka dots, chevron patterns, which are like the repeating arrows. So there was a lot of geometric, bold patterns. Those were really big in the 1950s. And of course, light colored wood. I don't think light colored wood has really been in style perhaps any time except for the 1950s. But like very blonde, pale, like pine type wood was really big for furniture at that time. And of course, space or atomic age inspired design, which is often, of course, also called mid-century modern, which is a huge deal in the vintage antique world. It's a vastly popular like subset of vintage collectible items that sell like hotcakes. So that is one of the big things that came out in the 1950s, mid-century modern, and of course the Stepford Wives, which I'm totally honoring today in this outfit. So that said, that is all I have for Journey Through the 1950s today. Really quickly, I'm going to do a little farewell here on the Instagram. So when I upload this video to YouTube, I can cut it off here because the other part, again, nobody's going to care about on there because the live sale prices are only good for you folks that are here watching. Alice says it's a fabulous outfit. Thank you. Thank you so much. But if you're here watching on YouTube and you're watching on the replay, thank you so much for being here. We hope that you enjoyed our little 20th century witchcraft journey through the 1950s. We hope that we catch you next time and that you have a wonderful week until we see you again. Next week we're going to be talking about goddess magic. We're going to be talking about Mother Earth and Gaia, and I'm very excited about that for Earth Week. So I hope that you all have a wonderful week. Take care, and blessed be.